Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Tesla's cuts, the EV leader letting go of thousands of employees. Can the competition take advantage? Plus, trade hope. China makes an offer it hopes the U.S. can't refuse. Beijing is proposing a plan to shrink the trade deficit to zero as talks are set to resume. And Amazon under more pressure over its controversial facial recognition software. Why shareholders are now joining the debate. But first, to our top story, shares of Tesla tumbled in Friday trading after CEO Elon Musk announced an estimated 3,000 job cuts. Shares plunged as much as 13% after Musk posted the email he sent to employees notifying them about the layoffs. This marks the biggest drop since September 28th, with the shares at their lowest levels since January 3rd. This follows Tesla eking out a profit in last year's final quarter. I want to get to Stamford, Connecticut, where New Street Research's head of global tech infrastructure, Pierre Farragut, standing by. He currently has a buy rating on Tesla. So, Pierre, of course, it's sad news when anybody loses their job. But in terms of the health of the Tesla business, is this encouraging or discouraging?
That's a difficult question, Emily. If you look at Tesla today, they are at a turning point. They've been selling 60,000 Model 3 in the US every quarter at a price above $55,000. If you look at what it represents in terms of market share, it is 60% of the US market for the sedan premium segment above $55,000. So we know this level of deliveries in the US at that price point is not sustainable. So, and on top of that, we know it has been supported by very strong subsidies. So as we get into 2019, Tesla gets a subsidy cut and has to lower its prices, has to start shipping cars abroad, and then has to start introducing in its mix lower price SKUs and ultimately the $35,000 Model 3. What do they need to do to achieve that? They need to adjust their cost base. And that's, I think, the meaning of this cost cut today. If you think about the numbers, this is going to help Tesla reduce its operating cost by a bit less than 100 million, which is what Tesla is giving in price cuts to US consumers with a $2,000 price cut they've announced earlier this month.
Right. So I have a chart in the Bloomberg here which shows Tesla's free cash flow turning positive in the last quarter. Elon Musk is saying they need to make these job cuts in order to get the cost of the car down to that $35,000 to reach a more mass market. But will they have enough people to meet production numbers and reach that mass market with these layoffs?
Excellent question. The best way to answer it, looking back at last spring, when Elon Musk announced in a very similar fashion that he was laying off 10% of the workforce of Tesla. That was at the end of spring. And 3 months after that, Tesla had succeeded the ramp of the Model 3, had produced over 50,000 units in the third quarter, broke even in terms of profitability, and generated the very strong free cash flow you just showed on this chart. So I think we are today in a similar situation. Tesla, since the summer, has grown a lot its staff, is now taking a step back, is implementing new efficiencies, taking people out, and then from that basis is going to be able to continue to grow delivery. So what I would expect, guided by Elon Musk's comment in his publication this morning, is Tesla to start the year just profitably and to be able to improve profitability during the year as it keeps growing production and growing deliveries of the Model 3.
Now, I have another chart here showing that because of the stock plunge today, because of these layoffs, Tesla's lost the market cap crown for automakers. Tesla is the white line there, GM blue, Ford yellow. You can see GM now slightly surpassing Tesla. of course, we know, Pierre, Tesla is a market leader in EVs. Tesla has first mover advantage. There are a number of different competitors that have electric cars coming to market this year. Sales will be slow initially, but could really take off next year. Is there an opening right now for the competition?
There is definitely an opening for the competition because Tesla is showing that this market is very strong. Can you imagine capturing 60% of its addressable market in the US in the first 2 quarters for the Model 3? Now, can they capture it? That's where I have more doubts. As you very justly said, Tesla has a first mover advantage. Tesla has been designing, manufacturing, refining, improving electric cars now for more than a decade. And when I look at cars that are being announced by competitors coming into the market this year and next, what I see is 2 things. From a technological standpoint, these cars are about 10 years behind what Tesla can do today. And then from a competitiveness standpoint, these cars are still very expensive in the higher end of the market, and none of what you can see announced by competitors today can really compete with the Model 3.
Elon Musk has broken ground on that factory in Shanghai. That will give Tesla some advantage over competing automakers, at least U.S. automakers, who make their cars outside of China. So this will enable Tesla to avoid tariffs on its cars inside the country. But at the same time, the Chinese economy is slowing down. We don't know what the health of the Chinese consumer will be. How optimistic are you about this factory in China giving Tesla a significant advantage?
So the good thing about this factory is that it's not built yet. So it's still to be built. It's still to be ramped. It takes a long time. The plan today of the company, as I understand it, is to be able to start assembling cars in Shanghai at the end of this year. By then, Emily will, of course, have like a much, much better perspective on what the global economy, how the global economy is evolving, how consumer demand is evolving in China. And of course, at that point in time, Tesla is going to be able to adjust its investment plans there in order to serve as justly as possible, as precisely as possible, the demand they can meet.
Now, Tesla's always been a very divisive stock. You've got big camp of passionate true believers and a big camp of passionate skeptics. Which of those do you think this year will be proven right?
Well, I hope the optimists are going to be proved right, as you can imagine. The reason for that, very simply, is that the year looks like a very strong ramp. We are going to fall off that cliff in the US of very strong pent-up demand going away, of subsidies being cut by 50% first now and then down to 0 in the summer. And as that happens, Tesla will ramp its production outside of the US. In Europe, where sedans are very popular, it's a very large market for sedan cars. Tesla is going to be able to introduce leasing to foster, to encourage demand. And most importantly, Tesla is going to introduce lower price points. And I would insist on the last one, Emily. The market, between the market for cars selling for $55,000 and more, and the market for cars selling for $35,000 and more, there is a 5x difference. In the world, we ship about $3,055,000 cars and $15,035,000 cars. So as Tesla is able to take its prices down, it should meet increasing demand everywhere in the world. And that's the reason why I am optimistic and positive for Tesla this year.
All right, New Street Research, Pierre Ferragu, thanks so much for joining us this Friday evening from Connecticut. Well, Alibaba is bracing for a slowdown in China's economy. The country's largest e-commerce company cutting its spending on travel and postponing some new hiring. Alibaba Chair Jack Ma warned in September that the trade war with the United States could have a much longer impact than anticipated. Coming up, Netflix shares tumble after reporting fourth quarter results. We'll take a look at the company's user growth and cash burn into original content. That's next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. Listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. This is Bloomberg. Netflix reported a lackluster fourth quarter. Thursday, the company's shares tumbling after revenue came in below Wall Street estimates. Hits like Bird Box and You attracting millions of subscribers just wasn't enough to boost the streaming service's slow sales growth. Joining us to break it all down, Justin Patterson, analyst at Raymond James, who's got a strong buy on the company. Also with us from LA, Bloomberg's Anusha Sakui, who covers the entertainment industry for us. So, Justin, are you as underwhelmed as some investors are today?
Not really. I would say you have to look at it from kind of a big picture perspective. To start the year, Netflix had more of a 30% move heading into earnings. You had expectations very high into the print in the wake of the recent price increase the other day. So Netflix really had to blow numbers out across the board, sub upside, margin upside. You did have sub upside. Margins were a little bit light in Q1. That was mainly a function of FX. So we think this is really a transitory phasing issue.
We're starting to get a little bit more information from Netflix, and we'll have to trust them on this, about subscribers, viewers. You know, Bird Box, 80 million viewers, they told us on the call. Take a listen to what Reed Hastings had to say about just how much share of the broader TV market they're snagging. Take a listen.
There's 1 billion hours of television content being consumed a day. We're winning about 10% of it. And so that's why, like Disney, they have great content. We're excited for their launch. And, you know, maybe they grow over a couple of years to 50 million hours a day. But that's out of the billion.
Anusha, we've talked to a lot of analysts on the show who are pessimistic about Netflix's future, given that companies like Disney are pulling their content, will prove to be more competitive in the future. But, in talking to the creators in Hollywood, most of them are still in awe of Netflix and don't seem to think there's much of a problem at all. What is the prevailing view there?
Well, you're right, and there is reason to be concerned if you're Netflix, and because Disney, AT&T, Comcast, they're all coming online in the next 12 to 18 months with rival streaming channels, and they are creating a moat of exclusivity around their own content. And we will see, and there are already numbers coming out about how much we will see the cost of content and the investment in content balloon for the media industry. But Netflix, if you've listened to Ted Sarandos and Reed over the past couple of years, have talked about this threat. So to give them credit, they have been preparing for that. And on their sort of video call yesterday, they did talk about how a vast majority of their content that is watched, I'm probably not phrasing that correctly, but like the most watched content is their original stuff. So whilst the majority, they have Friends and they have a ton of stuff on there, what people are watching is original. And that's what we're all talking about. We're talking about Bird Box, and we're talking about, You and other shows. So they have been very good at getting original content to keep us entertained. The big question is that as there's like a sort of plethora of these streaming entities, how are they going to survive? Where are they going to find their niche? To answer just your direct question about creators, they're just happy to sell their stuff. Let's just be real. They're just happy to get their stuff sold and be seen. It's very interesting to see someone like Alfonso Cuarón, who has Roma, which is the film that is on Netflix now, which is really a kind of odds-on favorite to win Best Picture next month. It's going to be a real important moment for Netflix if they win or even come close to winning. Because it's just a watershed moment. They've never been close to that before. So
right. Took home some Golden Globes and a favorite at the Oscars. Justin, you were nodding. As Anusha was talking there, I've got this chart in my Bloomberg showing how the rise in subscribers has actually generally mirrored the rise in the stock. So, do you think going forward, investors are going to be okay with strong subscriber growth, even if revenue doesn't necessarily keep pace with expectations?
Yeah, I think the revenue piece solves itself because, to the earlier point, Netflix has the viewership. It has nearly 140 million subscribers around the world. We think that number's 200 million by 2020. And when you go back to the creator problem, Netflix solves distribution. It solves discovery. It can make these programs available at a mass market way, whereas, say, Disney, Comcast, starting today with a new streaming service, they have to build up that global distribution. So from a Netflix perspective, it's already solved the tough piece. It has the audience. adding $1 or $2 a year in pricing, that's how you get to long-term free cash flow growth.
Anusha, what's the word on the content that Disney and some of these competitors will offer? I mean, do we know if it's going to be spectacular?
I mean, we know that they are, that the properties that we're talking about are Disney's like Marvel and Star Wars. That, for example, with the Lucasfilm properties, Netflix has that for this year, and then it comes off. I don't think that that's that important for Netflix, that's not how this business works. And I think it's kind of a super interesting point because, say, for example, around Bird Box, and maybe this is difficult to express, but people talked a lot about the fact that, a lot of analysts talked about the fact that, a lot of people saw it, 40 million, 80 million households saw it, and what that translated to in terms of box office. But I think fundamentally we're talking about different businesses. People sitting at home and streaming Bird Box is different to Disney getting people into theaters to see Star Wars. Now, they will have potentially 3 more Star Wars movies and a whole other world of Star Wars spin-offs that they're already working on. They have all the Marvel content that they will have coming onto their platforms, and they're very focused on content that not only gets people onto their streaming platforms, but that can be monetized through theatrical, that can be monetized through products, that can be monetized through DVDs, television, and other profit streams. Netflix is not interested in that. Although they do sell T-shirts, so I don't know.
Justin, quick last word.
Of course. I completely agree with that view right there. I think Netflix will be competing in a different area than Disney. The films that were just named right there, Star Wars, Marvel, those are all big budget pictures. Bird Box, not that expensive to make. There's a lot more Bird Boxes in the world than Disney type films, and that gives Netflix a lot of content it can buy.
All right, Justin Patterson, Raymond James, and our very own Anusha Sakui. Thank you both. Lots to watch, at the very least. Still ahead, new details in the courtroom showdown between Apple, Qualcomm, and the FTC. We will discuss next. This is Bloomberg. When Apple COO Jeff Williams told a courtroom that Qualcomm cut off its chip supply for iPhones, it was compelling testimony in the FTC's antitrust case against the semiconductor company. The FTC argues that Qualcomm won't sell chips if customers don't also pay hefty licensing fees. But a 2017 email exchange between Williams and Qualcomm CEO Steve Mollenkopf shows the relationship may have broken down for other reasons. Here to give us all the details, Bloomberg Tech's Ian King. So you know this story better than anybody else, and you've been as surprised by this case as we have, specifically Apple's testimony here that Qualcomm cut them off. But now we know that's only half of the story, right?
Yeah, I mean, the background is all along Qualcomm has said, look, we would supply Apple if they wanted. We want to be their friends. We want them as a customer. And then Williams says this in court. And we're like, wow, okay, that's not what we've been told. And then what we find out from the email exchange that he actually referenced in court, which we were able to obtain, was that they were arguing, oh yes, they didn't want to deal with each other and there was various complications, but it wasn't anything to do with the licensing, which is the heart of the case.
So what does this mean?
It really depends upon how the judge views this, whether this is used in court, and really, because we've had, remember, a week or more of the FTC making its case, lots of kind of potentially damaging things for Qualcomm coming out. Now Qualcomm is onto its chance to fight back and to explain itself and to show why it's not guilty of what it was accused of.
The judge has made some pretty interesting moves. Didn't she kick a lot of people out of the courtroom, and Wi-Fi wasn't working, which is so ironic, given that these are the companies that provide chips for Wi-Fi.
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right. It's no secret that Judge Lucy Coe, doesn't take any messing from anybody. If you mess around, if you don't know what's redacted or if you don't know what should be redacted, she has zero patience for either side, and she docks time off them, and she orders people out, and she's not taking any messing around. So we're led to believe that she's running a tight ship.
So how much longer does this case have to run?
Yeah, we've got about, I mean, in terms of time, it's another week or so, but 3-4 more days of actual testimony.
And in your view, who's winning? Who has the upper hand right now?
Well, as I just said, when it's the, you remember they're taking it in turns. The government goes first because they're the accusers. They have to set out their case. So naturally, they're going to throw lots of bombs in to try to make Qualcomm look as bad as it can be. So obviously, over the first week or so, Qualcomm looks like they're losing. Now, Qualcomm has its chance to say, hold on a minute, no, that's not what they said it was, and to explain themselves and to make a better case.
Now, when we sat down with Steve Mollenkopf, the CEO of Qualcomm, he said, he hopes that in the future they can, get back to doing business together,
right.
Apple and Qualcomm. I mean, after all of this ugliness, is that really possible?
Well, that's it. If you read the emails that we were able to write about today in the story, there was an attempt by both sides to be like, hey, let's forget this licensing. Let's deal here as a chip company and a phone maker. And there was an attempt to do that, but even within that relationship, there was distrust. So your guess is as good as mine.
All right, Bloomberg Tech's Ian King, continue that good reporting. Thank you. Well, Airbnb is said to be in talks to acquire hotel booking site Hotel Tonight. This, according to a report from the Wall Street Journal. Sources tell the Journal that talks have gotten cold but could be revived as the home sharing site prepares for an IPO. The acquisition could make it more attractive to investors and demonstrate more growth potential. Separately, Airbnb is said to be considering building its own competitor Hotel Tonight and eyeing joint ventures with boutique hotel chains. Coming up, Musk's firing spree. Tesla wasn't his only company changing its workforce size. We'll look at what's going on with SpaceX and Boring Company next. This is Bloomberg. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Back to our top story, Elon Musk's announcement that Tesla is cutting over 3,000 jobs. Overall, Tesla shares fell by nearly 13% in Friday trading, and it's been somewhat of a hiring-firing week for Elon Musk-led companies as SpaceX is cutting 10% of its staff, or about 600 people. Meantime, the Boring Company has announced it's hiring 80 new staffers. To discuss, let's go to New York, where our Bloomberg Business Week columnist Max Chafkin is standing by. So, Max, do you think Elon Musk made a New Year's resolution or something to get the workforce right at all of his companies?
You do wonder, and one of the interesting things about Elon Musk and this kind of interlocking group of companies is that there aren't bright lines between them. I mean, Musk is famously going back and forth between SpaceX and Tesla. Aspects of the Tesla operation are located very close to SpaceX. There's shared staff. I mean, they are two different companies, but at times the lines really blur. And it does feel like, maybe while Musk was looking at Tesla's operations and really looking at, we need to, get this company as close to profitable or as profitable as possible, he might have said, hey, maybe it's time to sort of, trim some at SpaceX. So I don't think you're wrong in that assumption.
So why are we seeing these layoffs at SpaceX? The COO, Gwen Shotwell, said there'd be fewer launches this year. Why?
So the thing that's happening with SpaceX is it's kind of transitioning from its Falcon 9 rockets, which are the ones that everyone knows, to this new rocket, the BFR, or I think they just changed the name, but basically it's a much bigger rocket that's designed to carry much heavier loads, and so some of the development is changing. The other thing is these Falcon 9s are reusable. I mean, the whole point of SpaceX was that they were going to be able to use these rockets, and that was going to bring the costs down. Now, they potentially don't need to manufacture as many rockets because they'll be able to use them. Now, that's good for Elon Musk's overall vision of making space much more accessible to humanity, but maybe not so good if you're an engineer or a worker at one of the factories.
And meantime, the Boring Company, the scale of hiring is much smaller, hiring about 80 people or so. But how significant is that given the nascent stages of the project and the potential payoff?
This looked very much like a hobby, a few years ago when we first started hearing about it. And, I remember when Elon Musk himself, told me about it, it sounded, not entirely thought through. But as they go on and it's looking more and more like a real business. I think it's something like 80 employees, and they have job openings, as our colleague Sarah McBride reported. So I don't know. It seems very early. This sort of demonstration track that they showed off in Los Angeles looked, while kind of cool, nothing like a sort of finished product. On the other hand, this is kind of what Elon Musk has been famous for, is taking these crazy ideas and turning them into businesses.
All right, Bloomberg's Max Chafkin, thank you so much for being across all of that for us. We'll be watching to see how the year pans out. Now, to a story we are following: the continued trade tensions between China and the United States. Bloomberg has learned that Beijing has offered to go on a 6-year buying spree to ramp up imports from the United States. Reportedly, this means Beijing would increase imports by more than $1 trillion over that period. I've got a chart in the Bloomberg here. You can see just how big that U.S. trade deficit with China is. The last month of this being the biggest difference on record between the two countries. For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg senior trade reporter Sean Donnan from Washington. So, Sean, actually the trade deficit has widened in the last few months, not narrowed. Can the Chinese actually close the trade gap by 2024?
Depends who you listen to. If you listen to most economists, they would argue that trade deficits are the result of a confluence of factors. But, economists aren't the ones that drive the political messaging here in Washington. And Donald Trump, one of his campaign promises was to attack the trade deficit with China. The irony that hasn't been lost on many people is that in the last 2 years, it has widened, as that chart shows. And so Donald Trump needs to deliver something. And he has been, focused on these talks. Reducing the deficit has been one of his clear goals, and the Chinese have been listening, and they've come up with a big buzzy offer to try and lure him into a deal, perhaps.
So let's say this is possible. What would the Chinese buy from the United States?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of whether this is possible. There's a lot of questions about just how possible it is. The U.S. exports something like $150 billion in goods a year. They're talking about ramping that up to $600 billion a year inside 6 years. That seems improbable. It would mean buying a lot more soybeans. We've all been hearing about soybeans in these wars. That amounts to about $14 billion a year now, or before the trade wars hit. A lot more LNG and energy, a lot more planes, and a lot more manufactured goods. But one of the drivers of the deficit is not just what the Chinese buy, but what American consumers and companies buy. And how do you tackle that when we're still going to be buying a lot of smartphones and laptops from China for the foreseeable future?
Now, let's talk about how the U.S. has reacted to this plan. Don't folks here want the Chinese to close that gap, but in like 2 years, not 6? Absolutely.
So what we've heard is that, and this all came out of negotiations a couple of weeks ago in Beijing, these kind of mid-level working group negotiations, where it was the first time the Chinese really detailed this plan. And the initial reaction from the Americans, we're told by folks on both sides, it should be said, was skepticism, but also to kind of ramp up and say, hey, actually, we'd like you to see you close the deficit in 2 years, which gets into American political cycles in the 2020 election that's looming. Clearly, Donald Trump wants to demonstrate some real change before then.
Well, exactly, because beyond that, it's not just that the U.S. wants the trade deficit to close or wants the Chinese to buy more goods, but wants them to offer some other things in return when it comes to intellectual property and forced transfer of IT.
Absolutely. So that's been one of the big demands from the U.S. side is some change in the Chinese IP regime. The U.S. These tariffs that are in place now are based on a report that alleges decades of state-coordinated theft of American intellectual property and technology. Washington wants that to end, and it's not just Donald Trump. There's a broader bipartisan consensus, which gets into some of the politics of this. If Donald Trump was to take a deal that only involved a lot of or a big number for purchases from the Chinese, this $1.2 trillion offer, there'd be a lot of people here in Washington, including in the business community, who'd be disappointed that he didn't use the leverage that he's gotten from tariffs to get some more meaningful changes out of China.
All right, Sean Donnan, who covers trade for us out of Washington. Sean, thank you so much for that update. Okay, coming up, competing with online shopping, we discuss Tulip's push to bring savvy tech to brick-and-mortar stores. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Retailers have invested heavily in e-commerce and in-store technologies, but are they ignoring their biggest advantage? Mobile platform Tulip says store associates are, in fact, the biggest advantage that retailers have over Amazon and other big-time e-commerce players. Now, Tulip is looking to put the spotlight back on peer-to-peer help when you get inside stores. Joining us today for Retail Transform Tulip CEO Ali Asaria. Currently, there are 60,000 in-store associates using the Tulip mobile platform across 3,000 stores. So tell us how it works.
Well, what we're seeing at Tulip is that massive retailers, companies like Michael Kors, Coach, Chanel, what they're doing is they're giving all of their store associates devices and iPads, and they're putting apps on those devices to help serve their customers better. And so a Tulip-enabled store is a store that has Tulip on those devices and allows store associates to really check customers out and take payment anywhere on the floor. It allows them to communicate with customers back and forth over email and SMS. It allows them to answer product questions. And all of those things they can do without leaving the customer side. So Tulip is really about bringing intimacy back into retail.
Now, let's talk about the seamlessness of the experience, because, I've had several experiences with store associates, with their iPads. Sometimes it's not working. They can't find what they need. It takes a little bit longer. I have no idea if that's because of your software or someone else's. But, in some ways, it seems like it's still going to take more time to have some of these technologies properly integrated into the in-store experience.
Right. I think what you saw over the last few years was that large retailers were first trying to build a lot of these applications themselves. And so they would either take a website or a skinned version of their e-commerce site and give it to store associates. And they weren't really designed to be used in a store on the Wi-Fi that's in a store. So Tulip's all about, as we came into the market, we said, what if we could build a more robust piece of software that's sold in a SaaS world where retailers could deploy it but rely on us to basically make more reliable applications, right?
Now, Amazon can use AI and data to get merchandise in front of you as soon as you get to the site, whereas when you walk into a store, that retail associate doesn't necessarily know anything about you. So how do you combat that?
Well, I think that's kind of the coolest thing that's happening at a macro level in retail, is that as you see the rise of e-commerce happening and retail really feeling much more impersonal, what a lot of these retailers are doing is that they're reacting by actually going the opposite direction. So they're really trying to establish personal connections between the store associates that you work with every day. And those store associates now have tools like Tulip, which allow them to remember your name, send you a personal message after you leave. And so it's kind of unique that in a way that as the rise of the internet kind of makes things feel impersonal, retailers are reacting by actually going the other direction and using technology to make it feel very intimate, right?
For this to work, does it require associates to get proper training, or is it more intuitive than that?
Well, that's kind of a cool thing that Tulip had to learn over the last 5 years, is as we were deploying the software, right, tens of thousands of associates were kind of inheriting the software all of a sudden one day, and we had to figure out how do we get them to all use the application and learn it. One of the biggest investments we've done, though, is really focus on the user interface, and so a big thing that Tulip did was we co-designed the application actually in Cupertino with Apple. And a lot of the work that we did to make the application feel native and kind of like every other app that's on your phone allows store associates to really pick up the device and feel like they already know how to use it before getting any training. Right?
All right, glad you mentioned that partnership with Apple. Ali Asari, CEO of Tulip, thanks so much for stopping by. Coming up, Amazon's facial recognition software has sparked debate with civil liberties groups. How investors are cranking up the pressure next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Tech. Some breaking news now out of Washington. The Trump administration preparing an executive order that would significantly restrict Chinese state-owned telecom companies. This would impact potentially Huawei, potentially ZTE. Of course, the president has been very vocal about his concerns, national security concerns around these companies. We don't know yet the details about how this order would actually be written, but it would give greater authority to the Commerce Department to review products and purchases by companies connected to adversarial countries, one of which, of course, is China. We'll continue to follow that story and bring you in the headlines as we have them. Meantime, last year, civil rights groups came after Amazon's facial recognition software. Now, Amazon shareholders are getting involved. Friday, a group of activist shareholders filed a resolution proposing the tech giant stop selling its software recognition to government agencies until its board determines the tech doesn't threaten civil liberties. The ACLU, among other advocacy groups, has raised concerns over the tech's potential bias and reliability. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg Tech Spencer Soper. So, Spencer, give us the backdrop here. You know, we've all heard the horror stories about facial recognition technology and Amazon's facial recognition technology, in particular, misidentifying people. But has there been progress?
Yeah, well, Amazon definitely wants to highlight some of the positive ways this has been used. And so they bring up things like preventing child abductions and spotting missing children in amusement parks as examples, as well as just some of the softer applications like, identifying celebrities at events. There's one police department we spoke to in Oregon that put them in perspective. Their monthly bill, I think, was $12. To use this service, and they would use recognition to very quickly and efficiently cross-reference either photos from of suspects or even surveillance video footage and cross-reference that against a database of like 300,000 jail booking photos. And so it's just a very easy tool for them to identify criminal suspects.
So how does this pushback from the ACLU sort of amplify the blowback?
Yeah, and so the ACLU, was one of the activist groups that complained about this last year, and there was another one as well. And so now what we have is this is spilling into the boardroom. So we have a shareholder proposal. It's not a huge threat. The Amazon shareholders tend to vote in lockstep with what the board recommends. So it's not a huge threat, but it simply amplifies the debate a little bit, keeps it in the news, and brings it into the Amazon boardroom for more discussion. And it is important that they're not saying don't sell this at all. They're basically asking the board to say to check out the technology. Only sell it if you can guarantee it's not going to be misused to violate civil liberties.
So what's next here?
Well, now you'll have a vote of shareholders, but obviously beyond that, there's just this ongoing tension and debate about the use of this technology, and there's even been talk about potentially regulating its use, and that's where Amazon has said that they're working with government agencies and law enforcement agencies on educating them on how to use it, how to dial up the accuracy levels, but also emphasizing that it's not the single determinant of a criminal investigation. It's just one of many tools. So I think the next thing we're going to see is just a lot more tension between the two sides on whether this technology is ready to be deployed or not.
All right, Bloomberg Spencer Soper for us on Amazon's controversial facial recognition technology. Thank you so much. Spencer, I want to get back to that developing story we told you about, the Trump administration preparing an executive order that could significantly restrict Chinese state-owned telecom companies from operating in the United States, given national security concerns. Here to discuss, Bloomberg Tech's Alistair Barr. Now, as we write the story, this order wouldn't specifically name companies like Huawei and ZTE, but we know that that's what this order is addressing, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that one of the key questions to ask about this is it going to just let the Commerce Department ban sales of telecom equipment in the US, or is it going to ban sales of telecom equipment to countries that the US deems to be, unworthy of or dangerous, like Iran? And Huawei's already got into trouble for operating, trying to operate with Iran and lying to banks to move money around related to that. So I think, from Huawei's perspective anyway, I think they've probably written off the US as a market already, but they're huge in Africa, they were huge across Europe, and they're huge across Asia. So if the US, if this order basically goes out and says you can't work with Iran, you can't work with all these other countries too, then that would be another extra major blow for Huawei.
Now, obviously, Huawei, particularly interesting. They have pledged to take global leadership of 5G. Meantime, you've got other countries pushing back on Huawei over national security issues, not just the United States. You've got their CFO, the daughter of the founder, under house arrest in Canada, facing extradition to the United States in the middle of a trade war between the United States and China. I'm wondering, where is most of the pressure coming from? Is the administration aligned with the DOJ, aligned with what's happening in all of these other countries in terms of this action that's being taken against Huawei?
I think from the DOJ side of things, certainly in the recent months we've got messages from people inside the DOJ who basically said it is a major concern. So it's not. I don't think it's just politics, of the White House, things like that.
And in some case, we're talking about issues that have dated back to the Obama administration.
Yeah,
correct?
There was the Senate report in 2011. It's important to say that there's never been any solid evidence of actually something happening, but it's more like DOJ sources basically told us a month or so ago, just step back and think if Huawei and ZTE equipment are in 5G networks in 10 years' time all over the world, it would be very easy to collect information about what's going back and forth through those networks.
At the same time, isn't this a helpful lever to be pushing in trade talks, and does it put the Chinese under more pressure to make a deal?
Well, this morning there was some news out that Bloomberg reported about this idea that China's pledged to buy $1 trillion of extra goods. I'm not sure what those goods would be. That's a lot of money, but it shows that maybe they're giving way, and maybe Donald Trump's negotiation strategy, which is very, very aggressive, right? Maybe he's piling on.
So, all of this coming as we're going into tech earnings season. We've been looking at chip makers and suppliers to, smartphones, the iPhone, Huawei's smartphones as well. What sort of earnings results are we expecting across the board, given the broader political and economic uncertainty we're dealing with here?
Certainly, government business in the US delayed probably a quarter because of the government shutdown, some big government software purchase deal. Those things are probably delayed a quarter, so that's not great for some software providers. But in general, the cloud is still good, still growing. Enterprise hardware stuff is not quite so good. Smartphones still in the doldrums, PCs still in the doldrums. So the only real standout, I would say, is cloud providers, and maybe digital advertising is still probably churning away.
Now, meantime, we're hearing from sources that both sides, both President Trump and President Xi, might be eager to make a deal because both are concerned about their economies. Both are concerned about, the pressure that we've seen some of these companies facing. Meantime, the President of the United States has other priorities. We just got a headline that he's going to make a major announcement on Saturday with regard to the border. We're in the midst of a government shutdown, the longest U.S. government shutdown in history. Is there any sense that that this is more of a priority than the trade war, which could lead him to acquiesce perhaps there, but not here. Do we know which order the priorities are in?
I feel like if you're going to order them time-wise, I think the border wall and the shutdown is probably the highest priority, and then the next one on the list is the trade war for sure. And I feel like, you know, if the economy really slows down, and especially if the stock market doesn't do well, that's not great for President Trump. But I think China has a lot more to lose in this, right? Their economy, I think, has suffered more so far, and their stock market fell a lot more, and you know, I think the Chinese Communist government has a lot more to lose.
Right. Okay. Alistair Barr, our Bloomberg Tech editor, thank you so much for all of that. We will continue this conversation next week. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Be sure to join us next week for full coverage of IBM and Intel earnings. We're also, of course, live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology. Follow our Global Breaking News Network TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.